I want to talk to you about the successes and failures of this operation. So we're 3 months in. We've had a decent amount of time to look at how this operation's going. Can you start by introducing yourself? Who are you for somebody who might not be familiar with you?
Yes, of course. I call myself Richard Hannay on Twitter and on Twitch. I studied military history for my first degree, and now I'm finishing my master's in international relations, international security track. And yeah, I've been talking a lot about the war in Ukraine. I've done some more stuff on the political side of YouTube. My own channel is still underdeveloped, I would say, but I have talked to a few big names in this space, and people tend to like what I have to say, so they keep inviting me on, and I invite myself on a few times.
Well, the thing is, I don't always like
yeah.
what you have to say, but just because I don't like what you have to say doesn't mean it isn't true.
Yeah, I mean, I think I say it well enough so that people don't think I'm some just ranting jerk. Sometimes I have bad news to say, I'll just say them. But you know what? I don't like waver like a fig leaf. You know, so many people will the moment you try to tell bad news, they won't say bad news because they start dooming. I'm an anti-doomer. I don't like dooming. Yeah, that's I mean, most of the time I doom too. I'm a human, you know.
We all doom a little bit. It's only natural. When a young boy starts to grow up, you know, his body goes through some natural changes. One of those changes is he starts to doom more. Now let's talk about this counteroffensive. So going into the counteroffensive, this was after two largely successful counteroffensive, the counteroffensive in Kherson and the counteroffensive in Kharkiv, and then it was long winter attritional fighting. The fighting around Bachmoot is probably what most people remember from the attritional fighting. Not a lot of gains for the Russian, but some gains around Bachmoot. While there was some counteroffensives after the fact, nothing that actually took back the city of Bachmoot. Fighting around there is still ongoing. But now, everybody is looking mostly towards the counteroffensive down south, the counteroffensive in Zaporozhye. Now, this didn't come as a big surprise, though, when the counteroffensive south happened, did it? I mean, we talked about it before it happened, that most likely it was going to be in Zaporozhye and not, you know, in Luhansk or not across the river of Kherson. Why is it that the Ukrainians are attacking in Zaporozhye?
Well, I think there's a clear strategic goal when it comes to Zaporizhia. Any attack in any other part of the front would just have kind of troubles justifying itself. I mean, if you're attacking in perhaps Luhansk would have had some strategic justifications, maybe cutting off the supply lines coming from Strabolisk and falling and hoping that Russia would have to take a longer way around, but. It's not it's not on the scale and on the possibility of success that a good offensive in Zaporizhia could provide. I mean, cutting off that land bridge or maybe reaching Melitopol.
Now, when you say the land bridge, you mean the connection between what is internationally Russian recognized territory and Crimea outside of the Kerch Bridge. They use the land between Mariupol, Metiopol, all the way down the Crimea. So they have two ways into Crimea, both the Kerch Bridge and the land bridge, which is something that the Russians have wanted for a while.
Yes. It is. I'm talking about basically the south of Donetsk, the south of Zaporizhia Oblast, and most of Kherson Oblast. Those are the areas that consist of that land bridge. But basically, it's not only us that saw the strategic implications of such an offensive. It's also the Russians, and they prepared a lot. They built many trenches that were downplayed by some, to my chagrin. They built many anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and made a really extensive use of minefields. I think, as you said, I saw your video recently. Yeah, it's gonna be demined for the rest of our lives for sure. It's gonna be killing people in the 2100s.
If you believe the environmental minister and certain predictions, and of course, I believe these predictions might even be an undercount, because a lot of times in my experience, you won't find out that an area is mined until you find out that some dog or some wild animal set off some mine, or God forbid some local, and then you find out there's an extra minefield there. But current predictions have it about 30%, about 1/3 of the country being covered in mines. And my conversations with demining crews tell me about 80 to 100 years of demining work. That's for the last 8 years of fighting, from 2014 to 2022. Then you've got the Russian invasion on top of explosives from World War I and World War II, which are still buried in the ground.
I mean, something to also consider apart from the humanitarian damage that extensive mining on a big part of a country can do. It's also the fact that all of these places are largely farmland, right? That Ukraine uses for a big portion of its economic activity and its impact in the world. So this war is like long term is to an extent crippling Ukraine. And its ability to produce wheat. This farmland can't be used if there's just mines laying around. They have to be cleared. And when you have a plot of land, you need to clear the whole plot. You can't just leave it like this. So it is just a phenomenal amount of damage. It's not just, oh, you're throwing mines into like rocky terrain or whatever, or you got it's just some irrelevant place. It's where Ukraine makes its money. It's just a really terrible situation all around.
There isn't just deminers in the front line in this area trying to clear the way for the counteroffensive. People with demining experience are needed all across the country, especially anywhere that was occupied by the Russians. I was in the Kharkiv Oblast living with deminers for a month. They desperately needed equipment. They desperately needed help from NGOs. They desperately needed experts from overseas. A lot of the people that are working on these crews are getting about a month of training through a speed run course. There's like 3,000 to 5,000 max personnel with CESU emergency services doing work across the country. Their resources are already strained, period. So having enough to get through the minefields, which I do think that they under predicted how much there was, how much explosive material, how many mines they were actually going to be facing. It is one of the more what's the word? Herculean? I can't believe I'm forgetting it.
Herculean.
Herculean task. You're in Greece. You're supposed to tell me. You're in Greece. You have to tell me.
I will tell you something else. I have a friend, a buddy, my friend Beat, was saying, hey, you should tell Dylan how to say Melitopol. Because he keeps saying Metilopol.
Everybody who I guess is either new to my channel or is unfamiliar, if you think you're going to get me to pronounce a word correctly, you are sorely mistaken. Horribly mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, it's all right. It's all right. You said the Herculean, so that's,
I mean, like,
that's better than
mispronouncing words is part of American culture.
I do agree. I have yet to meet.
So they're
an American.
they're facing this massive task. They're facing this massive task in conducting this counteroffensive and cutting off the land bridge. But I want to know why they want to cut off the land bridge. What would happen if the Ukrainians cut off the land bridge here? How much would that help the Ukrainians?
It would be massive. I mean, if they were able to cut the land bridge at any point, meaning it doesn't matter if they take Melitopol or not, if they went to the east of that and just somehow reached Berdyansk, let's say, it would mean that anything west from the point that they reached the sea at would become completely untenable, and the Russians would just have to retreat to Crimea. And even then, they might even have to leave Crimea, because with Ukraine reaching the sea, they would basically be in range, if I'm not mistaken, of the Kerch Bridge. So they would just like destroy the Kerch Bridge slowly. So it would just make it so much harder for the Russians to supply Crimea. They would have to do it by ship, and that's just not ideal. So it could force the Russians into a corner. It would definitely lead to, in my opinion, the liberation of the entirety of Zaporizhia Oblast and Kherson Oblast. It would be a really, really big strategic victory.
I mean,
Yeah.
it would almost mean the complete return to 2014 lines outside of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Yeah, basically. That's
I
exactly what it would mean.
I do also want to say that when it comes to the protection of the bridge, I don't know if you heard the new report that's come out today, but Ukrainian military intelligence is suggesting that the Russians are sinking ferries off the coast of the Kerch Bridge, hoping that the ferries would be able to create a barrier to stop any future UAV, boat drones. What I forget what they call them. They call them like the little babies or something. The Ukrainians have nicknames for them, but the boat drones, which have been used to harass both Russian ships and the Kerch Bridge. I don't know how successful that's going to be in protecting it, though. I doubt.
That sounds really odd.
Do you buy that claim from military intelligence?
I mean, I don't know that much about seaborne operations and whether or not those boats could be impeded. But if you're gonna sink a ferry, doesn't it have to stick out of the water if it's gonna affect these boats? These boats don't.
I believe that's the
going
idea.
too low.
Yes. Yeah, I believe that would be the idea.
I mean, technically, if they stuck out all the way, but they would have to barrier off like a huge extent of. And why do it by sinking ferries? It just seems very odd.
Who knows? But then again, I mean, the Russians did resort to digging holes in the road in order to stop the advance on Moscow. So it's not like they
I remember that.
They aren't willing to do a little crude work to get the job done.
I was having a barbecue that day. I was just
the whole country over here was having a barbecue. A lot of popcorn, man. A lot of salo, a lot of borscht. So obviously very useful to the Ukrainians. It would mean liberating two whole oblasts, two whole regions, most likely the Zaporozhye Oblast and the Kherson Oblast. It would mean isolating the Russians in Crimea. Most likely, it would mean an easier access to destroy the Kerch Bridge. It would put the Russians in a gigantic bind. And almost return them back to 2014 lines outside of Donetsk and Luhansk. Those would be the only areas that had still seen Russia actually gain upon their 2014-2015 holdings. So obviously, very big achievement for the Ukrainians. Would be very helpful. It would horribly strain Russian lines. The plan was originally to get started right at the start of spring of this year, but that didn't happen. There was a fear of, wanting to get this started as soon as possible, because the longer you wait, the more entrenched the Russians were going to get. That's why everybody was also very critical of the United States and many of Ukraine's allies for saying that they were dragging their feet on aid and delaying the start of the counteroffensive. Why did the counteroffensive take so long to get underway, months after what many people would have expected?
I mean, in my opinion, the Ukrainians were just hoping to get enough equipment to do it. I mean, when they were looking at the kind of defensive lines they were facing and then looking at the engineering equipment they sorely lacked, and the tanks that they likely lacked as well, they thought that, hey, I mean, if we're going to do this, we might as well do it in a more favorable position. I think the Ukrainian defense minister or somebody, they put out a list of equipment that they needed, and I mean the Western partners haven't really matched it. They have done the classic thing of just giving less than requested and saying you'll have to do with this. But I still feel like not all the blame for how the counteroffensive started late or whatever could be laid at the hands of the Western partners. I mean, blame if we accept that this situation isn't ideal. I would say that there's a few factors that have contributed to that.
Can you tell me a few of the factors?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of them, of course, the biggest one I would say is the fact that Western countries have dragged their feet. They haven't truly accepted that this is a war involving everyone. And
recently, Mark Milley, when it was asked this in an interview that I read, and he rejected this assertion, saying that they've provided, a very large amount, have been extremely helpful in providing these munitions. What type of munitions could have been provided faster, do you think?
Well, they definitely could have provided, I think, more armored vehicles, but I think it's not just the armored vehicles or the artillery. It's just the fact that, yeah, of course, the Western partners have kept Ukraine in the fight, and we shouldn't like underplay that. It's still very important to recognize that the Western partners have done that. When I say they're dragging their feet, I mean that when it comes to increasing production, they have done it within capabilities that exist right now. They haven't done like the extraordinary. You know what I mean? Uh, they haven't mobilized their economies to actually provide Ukraine as much as possible. They've done everything in a slow and bureaucratic manner. They've bickered about F-16s for a long time. They've bickered about tanks for a long time. They've bickered about the ATACMS. It's just all so tedious and going so slowly on their end. But they are doing things. I'm not saying that they aren't. They're definitely one of the main reasons that Ukraine is still fighting this war. Now, there is of course the counter argument to that, that's saying, yeah, equipment wouldn't just necessarily like solve all of Ukraine's problems. There are other things. There isn't just like a lack of equipment. There's a lack of capability, like an air force, for example, proper big air force. They don't have that, and they won't have that. I think for the next couple of years at the very least, and I'm being optimistic. I don't think in the duration of this war they'd be able to match the Russian air force. But then there's also the fact that, yeah, Ukrainian commanders probably made some mistakes. Soldiers on the ground definitely did complain, and certain lower level command complained about the types of attacks they were asked to do. And I also believe personally that putting a lot of fresh and motivated soldiers into these units, creating new units for this offensive, was probably not the best idea. If it was up to me, and I'm saying that in the most armchair general way possible, I'd put the new units in more of defensive roles and pulled mostly veterans and other like really better brigades and put them in this offensive role. But it's all beside the point. To me, it doesn't seem that Ukraine was equipped to do that breakthrough even at that later date. Well, big breakthrough that the Americans were talking about.
If I remember, the idea was that a lot of these units that were being trained were trained in Western countries, trained under the idea that they'd be fighting under combined warfare doctrine or some form of, armored breakthroughs. That's what they were training for. And then they would take the people who were training for this exact operation and then put them out to fight in this type of exact operation, which is very different than a lot of the fighting the type of fighting that they expected to engage in, or the type of operation that they expected to engage in, is very different than, say, the grinding battle of Bachmoot and the type of like house-to-house fighting that was going on there, which is much different to the wide open fields that you're going to see in this part of the country, which I saw when I was in a rehiv.
Yeah, that's fair enough. In a sense, maybe you're taking troops that haven't engaged in that kind of fighting. But honestly, I think that there are shortcomings as well with training an army to fight in the way NATO would fight this battle, when it doesn't have the same capabilities as NATO. It doesn't have the air force that NATO has. And when the Americans suggest, you could have concentrated in one spot, perhaps, in that leaked report. I don't know. Maybe that leaked report is saying crap, but concentrating in one part it doesn't really. I don't think it would change much how it would go. In fact, I think it would probably harm the Ukrainians in this situation. They would have to keep pressure along the entire front for such an attack to work in the first place, and numbers are almost 1-to-1. How would you even concentrate in one area? And then if you concentrate in one area, how would you suppress Russian artillery effectively enough to not destroy your concentrated units? How would you deal with enemy air power? It seems to me like a lot of people who are making these suggestions are they're not fighting that war. They're fighting another one in their heads,
So before we get into the U.S. intel report, which I do want to ask you about later, so the operation is delayed. For what you say is I think you said mostly due to a lack of material, a lack of equipment and readiness for the operation. But months later, after when it was originally scheduled to start, and Zelensky did say that it was due to a lack of equipment as well, or they needed to be more prepared. So the government was pretty open about that. Then it did start eventually, and it's been going on for 2 to 3 months. How did the operation start off? Can you give me a rundown to how this operation started?
I mean, yeah, I think the two main axes that the Ukrainians went for was Velika Novosilka, aiming south, and then the other one, which was Okryhiv, aiming towards Tokmak. Now, when it started out, there were some major armored assaults, and using new equipment that they got, and those got stuck in minefields. Especially, I think the 47th Mechanized Brigade kind of suffered quite a bit. I think its inexperience and the really tough sector they were fighting in just wasn't the best. Other new brigades that fought in the Velika Novosilka area had more success. It was more promising, I would say. But then things kind of slowed down because of the minefields, and the Ukrainians decided that they were taking too many casualties, I think, from these big frontal assaults, and they weren't going anywhere anyway. So they decided, instead of just having to tackle minefields with vehicles, let's just push trench to trench with artillery support, getting smaller units to capture trenches so that they could move the line closer to the first defensive line. Then they went for a deep strikes campaign. I think that was happening anyway, but they were targeting logistics. They were using the storm shadows, using more drones. And that's just kind of how it has continued.
Can we stop and focus on that for a moment,
Sure.
actually? I wanted to stop and focus on those deep strikes because, as we were talking about earlier, part of the reason why the Russians had to leave Kherson was due to the logistics being so strained by trying to transport supplies over the river, which were being constantly harassed by the Ukrainians because it was well within range, right? Range of their artillery range. Definitely as they got closer within the city, it only became more difficult. So the Ukrainians, now empowered by, British shipments of Storm Shadows and the use of these drone boats and other tactics, have been trying very hard to damage Russian logistics in the Zaporozhye, hoping that if they were able to undermine those logistics, that the front line would start to crumble, they'd see less shells. Has that tactic bore any fruit? And how has that worked?
Well, you have to see it kind of like, say, the pumps on a sinking ship sort of situation. It's something that's gonna help to a certain extent, no matter what. Damaging the enemy's logistics is very important. It reduces, of course, their ability to put shells in the front. It damages their ability to concentrate for bigger pushes. It damages their ability to defend. However, I don't think it's gonna bore out the same way it did in Kherson, just because of the physical limitations that on Kherson were just much greater for the Russians. Now they can just change roads, they can rebuild what is destroyed, but that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians should stop. They should continue their deep strikes campaign at least to the ability to the best of their ability. What I am worried about is the limited number of storm shadows there are, and the kind of targets that the Ukrainians may pick. I mean, for example, there was that strike that was quite a bit publicized on that bridge that connected Crimea to. No, I'm not talking about the Kerch Bridge. I'm talking like a smaller bridge.
I'm familiar. It connects Crimea to mainland Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean that, for example, I don't think it was particularly worth a whole Storm Shadow missile. That kind of damage can be repaired, especially that far from the front, and keeping it down wouldn't impact logistics that much either. So personally, I feel like, yeah, as long as they they are focusing on good targets, maybe more critical bridges, more critical maybe depots if they can find them, because the Russians are dispersing nowadays, command centers, that kind of stuff. They should keep striking, because if you leave those unharassed, you just make it easier for the Russians to defend, and they are already in a really good position. In terms of, they have kind of the ideal defensive positions. They have spent so much time building them up. So you just have to do this deep strikes campaign. It's not like a question of what it brings about. It's kind of a must.
Got you. So so you're saying that this is essential for them to do, but that it hasn't garnered as much success in here as it did in Kherson, and that some of these strikes are not having as much effect as many people would have you to believe.
I mean, it's just not going to. It is the limitations in Kherson were just much greater. In my opinion, what those strikes do is they harm Russian logistics, but they don't end them. In Kherson, the strikes had the capability to just cut off the supplies, but now they can't. So what they do is eventually the Russians account to an extent for the damages that are happening, and they adjust to them, because that's just how armies act when they suffer attrition, because all armies do that. All armies will suffer attrition, and especially with Russia that has generally pretty deep stockpiles of equipment and stuff, they can just kind of work around a certain amount of attrition in their logistics chain. I mean, heck, I'm pretty sure the Russians even account for a certain amount of corruption that's having similar effects.
But so this harassment though of their supply lines and the attacking of the Kerch Bridge and stuff like that for certain can have an impact on Russian logistical flows. How, if we're talking about limitations with the Storm Shadow missile, how important is it? Definitely since Ukraine has been asking for these types of weapons, for Ukraine to get stuff like the Taurus missile from the Germans, or the ATACMS from the United States, or more munitions that can reach back towards supply depots, command posts, and locations, important logistical locations like the Kerch Bridge. If this counteroffensive is to be successful, or if they're going to give another swing at this if it doesn't pan out this year.
I mean, I think that people have just kind of turned ATACMS specifically into this kind of silver bullet. Only if Ukraine had ATACMS, it would just solve everything. And I'm sure you've seen. I mean, heck, there's entire channels that are dedicated to just saying how every strike was secretly ATACMS. But it's gonna be like a kind of like Storm Shadow, kind of like the Taurus. It's something that Ukraine should be provided with anyway, but don't expect it to just like solve everything. It's just gonna be further used to damage Russian logistics. But the victory has to come. The victory, the way I'm defining it, like the breakthrough, let's say breaking the Russian lines, will come down to offensive action. And it will also come down to how the Russians are doing, which honestly is kind of the big unknown here. What's the pain tolerance of those units in Russia's front line? How's their attrition doing? How, do they have enough replacements, considering the Russians haven't mobilized much more personnel since last September? Will Russia mobilize after they think they're safe from this offensive, or during it? Those are the questions I feel like are more interesting than just saying, oh, ATACMS or Storm Shadow. In my opinion, that's a clear cut. Yes, they should get it, but don't expect it to just like immediately solve everything.
Speaking of wonder weapons, I did want to ask quickly before we get into the successes and potential failures and U.S. intel reports about this. I did want to ask about cluster munitions. It was a really divisive topic when the Biden administration agreed to send it over. It seems that soldiers on the ground are saying that it is having an impact. It isn't really changing the balance of power, but that it has been used when capturing certain villages in the counteroffensive, and that it's been very effective against soft targets like lightly armored vehicles and trench lines, for example.
Yeah, I mean, cluster munitions aren't too terrible. They do their job fine for the most part. I think. I think the main controversy was about the dud rates and the fact that when you're using cluster munitions, to a certain extent, you'll have to clean them up afterwards because some of them are going to fail to explode.
Yep.
Some of them are going to, in the future, probably maim somebody. But this is kind of the cost of war. I think the main reason why the Americans decided on sending cluster ammunition wasn't necessarily the considerations of their effectiveness as artillery shells. They guessed, okay, they may not be perhaps exactly as effective as a normal 155 millimeter shell, high explosive, but the Americans are running low on regular 155 high explosives. They don't produce them at the rate they're sending them to Ukraine. So the stockpiles of cluster munitions that the Americans just aren't going to use, they're pretty big. I think, was it like 5 or 7 million shells? So the cluster munitions provide a very nice stopgap while the Western partners are still ramping up production. I still feel like the Americans have the capacity to ramp up production more, like genuinely invest in that area, but it's always a risk. It's even an obstacle risk sometimes, because any investments to an armaments industry that in the future is probably going to be underutilized. I think those are the kind of stuff that administrations think about when they decide to, say, build an armaments factory. It's the reason why, when you aren't in an existential war, it's actually pretty hard to mobilize an economy.
I do actually believe that I did see some messages from Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, explicitly stating that the reason we're doing this is because we're trying to use it as a stopgap until we pick up American artillery shell production for M55 howitzers, for 155 howitzers, and they've picked it up. I know it was 24,000 before the invasion. Now next year it's supposed to be 80,000, and it's not just the United States increasing production. I know the French have announced that they're tripling their artillery production, but that doesn't exactly mean it's an exceptionally large amount because the French weren't producing those many shells to begin with. But the idea behind it was, yes, that it was supposed to be a stopgap, or at least that's the justification the Biden administration used.
Yeah, I mean that's the way I see it. I see them as a stopgap. I see them as, sure, it's a capability in the front. It's gonna help a bit, but nothing game changing. It's just cluster munitions are there. They're gonna maybe cause a few problems in the future, but let's be real. The amount of mines that are in Ukraine right now, uh, cluster munitions make next to no difference on that kind of scale that we're talking about. So the calculus there doesn't change that much, in my opinion.
Got you. So I want to talk to you about the successes and failures of this operation. So we're 3 months in. We've had a decent amount of time to look at how this operation's going. It's not over. You know, I talked to the locals about when it's gonna get like particularly cold around here, and if we want to be generous, October is when it's gonna probably start getting so cold that really winding down offensive operations, unless the Ukrainians gonna keep it up through the winter, which would, you know, that would certainly be a decision. But October is probably when we're seeing like a real, like, okay, we gotta slow down. So we've got a few more months left. From what's already happened, what are the failures and successes of this counteroffensive?
Okay. I feel like there were certainly some successes in terms of preparing Ukrainians for future offensives. I think there were probably a few lessons learned about what it's like fighting on the offensive against very serious fortifications. There were probably also recognitions within Ukrainian command about, okay, which commanders are more competent, which others have problems. There were also I think Zelensky fired all the regional, what were recruitment center heads and replaced them with veterans.
Yep, all the regional recruitment heads have been replaced with
Yeah.
veterans, many of which or have been injured in combat to try to cut down on corruption. It was a practice where some of these recruitment heads would send people, if they paid them $3,000 to $6,000 American, to a doctor that they made an agreement with, where the doctor would give them basically the equivalent of a pink slip or a white slip to get them out of military service.
But those are a bit tangential. I think that honestly, the successes of this offensive come down to damaging Russian logistics and producing attrition for the Russians. And honestly, because we're talking a bit fatalistically, you know, as if this offensive has sort of failed. Yes, it is still ongoing. And something to consider is that since we don't exactly know how big the shortages of manpower on the Russian side are, we could see this front just kind of crack under the pressure. We know that the Russians are moving units around to put out problems, and the Ukrainians are also, of course, suffering pretty bad casualties. They are fighting on the offensive against really bad fortifications. But also, I feel like the Ukrainians are still in a better position when it comes to this offensive. The Russians are struggling in a lot of parts of the front. There are some doomer posts here and there on Russian Telegram, but that is a bit difficult to decipher.
They are difficult to decipher because it feels like anytime I need a boost, all I need to do is look at what the Russians are saying to each other, and it just always sounds like it's like 1944 Germany over there, no matter what's happened. Now maybe that's just a general trend when you have, you know, your hired private military contractors leading mutinies, marching on your capital. You're gonna be generally doomering. If World War II was for America was going how the war currently is going for the Russians, I would probably be doomering pretty hard as well if we had a war going similar to how there was going. But it is very hard to make it out because it just seems it's just generally depressive mess always.
Yeah. But generally, I would say that the biggest successes are probably going to be with attrition and with the deep strikes. But there are also failures, I believe, undoubtedly. Personally, I think that the deciding to go on the offensive in Bachmoot to take Klishivka, I think that's kind of a pointless thing. Like, why even go there? It's not like you're gonna recapture Bakhmut anytime soon, and it's not like the Russians are gonna prioritize Bakhmut over Zaporizhia. Maybe they would, but it feels like a waste of lives in that direction. And I would also say that specifically, this is kind of contentious, and I'm not 100% confident on it. But I see a lot of talk about the decision of Axis, where the Ukrainians decided to attack. So a lot of the clique of people I tend to talk to have emphasized that, well, perhaps they should have doubled down on Velika Novosilka instead of focusing that much on Okryhiv, because with Okryhiv, with that area, with where Robotine is, right, where they're fighting over there, it's so the fortifications there at the beginning of the offensive and now are just so much stronger. There's so many more layers of defensive lines, so many more mines than there are in Velika Novosilka, and it feels like the struggle for Robotine and Tokmak isn't really worth it when you consider that the same achievements could be that taking Tokmak or Melitopol would be achieved as well if they reached Berdyansk and they broke through the initially one line, now two lines of defense that are near Velika Novosilka. That area was, I think, much weaker, and sure, it's tricky terrain, and fewer roads, but it's nothing like the very deep defensive lines that were around Robotine, and that the Ukrainians are still fighting for now 3 months in. I feel like it's kind of a meat grinder over there, and it isn't worth it. Kind of like, if you remember, when we were talking about Kherson, that's quite a callback. But there was this kind of weird little bulge. Wait, let me find it. I'm opening Google Maps right now, and I'm trying to remember the river. It's that small river near Kherson. seems a bit off topic, but it'll if it clicks, it clicks. It will click well. Yeah, the river. Yeah, the inlets. Do you remember this little bulge on the Inulets River around Davidiv Brid?
Please remind me.
Yeah, it was a long time ago, but the Ukrainians had this bridgehead over near Davidiv Brid that they had fought for super hard and lost a lot of equipment in, and eventually it wasn't even decisive for ending the offensive. It was what ended the offensive. It was the deep strikes campaign, and I feel like that. A lot of lives were lost in that bridgehead over the Inulets without much payoff. And I feel like Robotine is kind of in the same ballpark, where it's costing a lot of lives, and it's not on the first defensive line yet. They're close to it now. I think they can see it, but I feel like that whole axis towards Stockmak is the most fortified one. I don't think it's worth it, but that's not to say that there should be a massive armored assault south of Velika Novosilka. That isn't gonna happen. I don't think there's gonna be a big concentration of forces, simply because big concentrations of forces, I'm gonna have to say, face the same minefields. They could get stuck in formation. They could get destroyed, and you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, all in one big attack. If it fails, it could tell the Russians that it's time to start maybe counterattacking or settling down. It's a bit of a mess. I'm sorry. There's quite a few things that I'm thinking about.
A bunch of things I want to respond to. So the first thing I want to talk about in the counteroffensive around Bachmoot, something that I'm constantly told about, or at least when I ask about why they're still fighting around Bachmoot, right? If somebody asks me about Avdiivka as to why they keep fighting there, one of the reasons I'm given, there's a few reasons, but one of them is that this allows the Russian troops to be tied up there. That you want to tie up Russian troops at other locations so they can't be redeployed, become more of a problem for the Ukrainian troops that are trying to push down in the south. Couldn't somebody make the argument that the reason they're pushing up near Bachmoot and trying to cause a crisis around Bachmoot is they understand that while Bachmoot has no more significance as a logistical hub or anything like that, the city has been wiped off the face of the earth. It has much political significance, and if they can create a crisis around it, it could force the Russians to have to redeploy, because losing Bachmoot would be quite humiliating for the Russian regime.
Yeah, you could make that argument. I think that though both sides are kind of playing this game of chicken, because the Russians are attacking north in Kupiansk, and I think that just kind of has the same objective, getting the Ukrainians to divert troops from their offensive.
To be clear, they've gathered, according to reports, around 100, and this is very rough estimates, and it's not an exact number, but they've gathered about 100,000 soldiers. It was about 900 tanks and 555 artillery batteries. That was what reports said, but who knows if that's accurate or not.
Yeah, I don't think that's accurate. If they had that many soldiers concentrated in that front, they could have probably made more gains. They have made some gains, and they did cross the Zerabets, but I don't think it. Not only does it sound like a lot, it probably is a lot. They haven't exploited that is enough to exploit a big success like crossing the river, and they haven't. So in my opinion, they're pushing with local units, not bad units, mind you. So they have some decent units over there, but they're still trying to get a good bang for their buck. They're trying to get more Ukrainian soldiers defending in that area where terrain can be given and taken liberally, than say in Zaporizhia, where the Russians have a tight budget on the amount of terrain they can give up. I don't think that there is. I don't think that it's a coincidence that they're fighting on before the first defensive line. Even, I feel like they want to discourage the Ukrainians and slow them from moving further south as much as possible, because the more south they are, the more they threaten the supplies that are heading into Kherson and Melitopol. So they try to keep them as far as possible. They try to to fight for every inch of ground, and of course that's costing the Russians soldiers. So yeah, you could say that there is a point to Bachmut, but I feel like it's not worth the effort.
I did want to talk about this location. I believe it's pronounced, and I'm very sorry, but Robotny.
Yeah.
This has been on the headlines for about a week now. Can you tell me the significance of this location? It's a village of about 1,000 people here. And for reference, if we were to compare it, like Bachmoot was a city of about what 35,000.
Yeah.
So it's not an extremely 50,000. You know, I forget its exact pre-war population, but a much more urbanly dense location. Can you tell me about the importance of this location?
Oh yeah, it's not the village itself. And like capturing, let's say if you captured just the village, like let's say tight ring around the village, it wouldn't mean anything.
And they've entered the center of the village. It's the south.
Yeah,
I think it's the south edges of the village where the Russians still have some troops in.
Yeah, they have some trenches there, but the main benefit that there is to be had is if you established a bit of a wider buffer around Robotyne, because then you'd have like command over the hills that surround Robotyne. So that's the more significant part, but I don't think that Robotyne is of any particular strategic significance. It's just like an obstacle on the road to Tokmak, and the biggest obstacles are still ahead of them.
It sounds like Bachmut then, actually. It was mostly just a stepping stone to other more difficult things they're gonna have to take down the line, because people talk about Bachmut, which it was a hell of a fight, but if they were to take Kramatorsk in the same fashion, it would be like a 3-4 times more difficult fight.
Yeah, I mean the strategically significant places are a bit further up the road. I think the first major defensive line is around Solodka Balka, and then there's Tokmak. Tokmak is the big prize in this front, but I feel like the way that this front is shaped is that they would have to basically kill everything ahead of them, and doing that on the offensive against fortifications so that they can just reach Tokmak, I feel like it isn't worth it. A few people are gonna disagree. They're gonna say, "Hey, I mean, it's one of the axes. They're achieving success there. They should keep pressuring the Russians." Yeah, I get that. It's just that, in my opinion, I guess I get the Spidey sense that attacking
the Spidey sense.
Yeah, in the most like fortified area in the front isn't the best of ideas, and it used to be part of Soviet doctrine, and a weird part of Soviet doctrine, to attack the enemy at their like toughest position, because if you take the toughest position, then what's left there to take? So, but I don't know. I think that kind of both sides are kind of a bit off. Those who are saying that like the Ukrainians should just concentrate a huge amount of forces to go on a decisive Schwerpunkt, that the Germans would say, or the Blitzkrieg. Let's call it that.
I'm unfamiliar. I didn't root for those guys in the Second World War, so you explain that to me.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know why it's that popular to call it. It's just like a concentrated attack.
All my World War II movies are mostly from the American perspective. I don't know all these terms, Yeah. Can you explain to me what you mean by that?
Schwerpunkt is kind of like the point of concentration. It's where you'd like collect a big bunch of armor to just smash a frontline position, and then have motorized or mechanized infantry follow up, take on the trenches, or exploit the gap that the armor has created. And that's kind of this is roughly, I'm not 100% familiar with all the nuances of the war of movement, the Bewegungskrieg that the Germans were.
Don't worry, I got it. Germans, concentration, point got across. Now, I do want to ask though, because something I have heard is that the Russians, in defending these positions, are not defending them in the most, let's say, effective way, where a lot of it isn't, okay, we've lost this position, move to your next defensive line. There's a lot of counterattacks, which haven't necessarily been extremely successful, And some are I've heard are concerned from Russian Telegram channels that they're kind of rushing all their troops to the front line, trying to stop the Ukrainians from taking literally an inch. And there's a concern that, well, if that front line ever breaks, what do they fall back to?
Yeah, I mean, a good argument could be said that a lot of their counterattacks are imprudent, but the Ukrainians are going to be, to an extent, frustrated by counterattacks because when you're counterattacking, they can't really move forward. But I feel like the Ukrainians are probably benefiting more from these counterattacks. The main problem is that they keep the narrative kind of within parameters, saying that the Ukrainians can't even reach the first defensive line. They can't even do this. They can't even do that. They can't take Robotin, whatever.
Is the price for them keeping the Ukrainians away from that first defensive line particularly high?
I think that it is. Yeah, I mean, it's not the most favorable terrain for the Russians to fight in. The most favorable terrain is their defensive lines. But still, they are causing casualties to the Ukrainians. So to an extent, they might be content destroying as much equipment as they can at the cost of a certain amount of manpower. But yeah, I feel like it's a bit under discussed that the Russians just haven't mobilized this much and now are facing the same manpower difficulties, maybe not to the same extent, but similar manpower difficulties as they were facing back last September.
Do you think that the Russians have a plan to deal with those manpower difficulties? Because I know that they've changed how the draft system works. They're going to raise the age from 27 to 30. They're going to raise the cap, and that's supposed to free up, what was it, like 2 million? Or but of course, like that's on paper, right? That doesn't
On
mean
paper, yeah.
Yeah, that's on paper, and we all know how the Russian recruitment bureaucracy works. So do you think that the Russians have a plan to deal with the recruitment problems? Because Putin seems a little hesitant to announce a second wave mobilization. It seems they're trying to find workarounds.
Yeah. It feels like they're trying to find workarounds, work with volunteers, and do recruitment for money and stuff. But honestly, I feel like a lot of the time Putin is motivated by failure. So big failures force him to act.
Like the
He's a
Kharkiv
major
counteroffensive is what started
procrastinator.
the first
Yep.
wave of mobilization.
Exactly. So on the one hand, I think, okay, maybe unless they have a huge failure in Zaporizhia, they won't mobilize. And then on the other hand, I
So
feel
wait,
like a lot
wait.
of
So to
people
be
are
clear,
seeing.
you would mean like, so if there was like a break, let's say the Ukrainians had a breakthrough and they took Mariupol and they just kept going and they took Kherson and Zaporozhye. That would be a scenario where you'd be like, Putin would panic and be like, another wave mobilization. He'd throw everything he had at the wall at that point.
So yeah, that could be one scenario. And another scenario could be that, I don't know, suddenly Putin becomes a bit more prudent and he's like, okay, let's wait for this counteroffensive to peter out. And then reinforce our lines with a fresh wave of mobilization, and give that fresh wave of mobilization enough time to prepare over the winter to be ready. There are some warning calls about another wave of mobilization, as you mentioned, but I'm not 100% sure that it's going to happen. It may happen, it may not happen, but we prefer if it doesn't happen, because if it doesn't happen, that means there's less that the Ukrainians would have to do to defeat the Russians in this front. I feel like if there is a chance that this offensive, which is still ongoing, might succeed, is if the line just kind of cracks and the Russians don't have enough to reinforce, don't have enough reserves to move around to slow down the Ukrainians.
I know this might be outside of your.
Yeah.
I know this might be outside of your purview, but do you have any inclination about how that could affect the Russian domestic situation, or if it would be accepted well in the Russian domestic situation?
I don't know. I feel like I don't think. I mean, if they had this big defeat in the south, it would definitely matter to an extent.
I meant another wave of mobilization.
Oh, another wave of mobilization. I think that would matter too, because eventually they would have to start recruiting in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But morale is a tricky thing. and guessing when a society will just crack, give up, or attack its leadership is not an easy feat, and that's especially the case with authoritarian countries. I feel like a lot was said about how Putin was about to fall, but I feel like because there's a lot of resignation in Russian society about the war. There's a certain amount that support it as well. I feel like I think it would hurt, but it wouldn't just end the war, you know? It wouldn't be what we want. It wouldn't be some kind of revolt out of it. At least I don't think so. It's hard for me to predict, but I feel like the Russians would complain. But they would probably take it. It's still, they're still somewhat undermobilized, and if we're comparing to the war in Afghanistan that they had engaged in, that lasted for years because 10 years was it, but time also matters. The amount of time is, I think, is as important as the amount mobilized.
That's true. And I would say that probably the war in Afghanistan was probably not as high intensity when it comes to casualties as the war in Ukraine is. The the Mujahideen did not have the equipment that the Ukrainians have. They can't even get past the first barrier of just taking over the country. But I wanted to talk about an element of this counteroffensive that I haven't seen covered that much, but I think is really important. And that is, from all the reports I've been told personally, from soldiers, from everything that I've heard from people who have been monitoring this more closely than I have, it seems to be that counter battery fire that the Russians have been putting out on this front is just not what it used to be when it comes to taking out Ukrainian artillery guns. And some Ukrainian artillery guns are no longer even engaging in the shoot and scoot tactics that have defined this war into protection of the artillery that Ukraine does have and tries to protect, because, there's, of course, a gigantic artillery disparity. Is this something that you've heard as well, that the artillery disparity between the Ukrainians and the Russians on this part of the war, this part of the front, is shortening the distance between their capabilities?
I mean, I think that the Russians still may have an advantage, but from what I've heard, yeah, I agree. The Ukrainians have done a remarkable job in Zaporizhia with their managing their artillery, using it not only to support units but also hunting Russian artillery. And I've seen a lot of complaints from the Russians as well that, hey, we can't even start firing a lot before we start getting harassment fire, and then basically the Russian artillery is dedicating more resources to fighting Ukrainian artillery instead of like bludgeoning Ukrainian attacks on the ground. So they are definitely, I think, approaching, maybe getting a bit closer to matching Russian artillery, but they're still a bit far off. I think they just, like, the mass they likely won't reach anytime soon. However, their counter battery efforts have been really remarkable, and they have definitely done some damage. I've seen also that I mean, sure, it's really hard to trust counters of equipment lost and destroyed, especially when it's either Ministry of Defense publishing them, especially the Russians. But the Ukrainians, if we take the reporting as, let's say, trends and not necessarily just like accepting their own numbers, the Ukrainians have been counting much more artillery destroyed than in previous offensives and in previous times this year, during this offensive. So even though that is, I don't know, maybe something that is not reliable too much, it's something to keep an eye out for. So yeah, I think I agree with your sentiment. The Ukrainian artillery has done a fantastic job.
So I wanted to talk about a little bit about problems that the Ukrainians have ran into, that because I know that we talked about, dragging our feet on equipment shipments, and I know that we've talked about, a difference in doctrine between what the Ukrainians have at their disposal, what they can do and what they can't do, and how that might conflict with American doctrine and what we've been training soldiers to do and what we've been advising them to do. What are things that you think that the Ukrainians have done that have been wrong, that have gone wrong, that might have affected the performance of this counteroffensive?
Honestly, I would mostly point to maybe over relying on fresh units that were trained abroad instead of hardened
This
veterans
is what you said
of
earlier. You wanted
war.
the veterans to be
Yeah.
the ones leading the way.
Yeah, I would have preferred, because I feel like, yeah, okay, whatever training, it won't prepare you 100% for what like, this kind of fight would be, and perhaps hardened veterans would have done a bit better. But if there's a lot of counterfactuals. It's not necessarily very easy to say. Again, same with preferring Velika Novosilka over Tokmak. That one I am more firm on. I think that they should have prioritized Velika Novosilka more, but the Russians are continually building defenses, and now Velika Novosilka is also becoming more difficult as an area to attack more vociferously. And then perhaps what criticisms the troops had with some perhaps less competent commanders. Um, Perhaps there was also some emotional or patriotic sentiments that maybe took hold more than they should have about attacking no matter what, or reinforcing attacks that didn't go that well, or maybe even attacking around Bachmoot. Uh, but my gripes are minor. I feel like for the most part, faults and all, the Ukrainians have done what they can with the equipment they have. And this mostly comes down to a capability gap, and it comes down to the fact that the Russians are just so well dug in. I feel like the Ukrainian strategy right now of just large scale attrition and small scale assaults could bear fruit. It would just take a lot of time and a lot of attrition from the Ukrainians as well. This isn't just what it does to the Russians, it costs lives to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are basically betting on the support of their partners and the support of their population to keep like hitting those defensive lines until they crack. And it's what like I am worried about Western partners. I am worried that there's a lot of like I don't know, whiplash from being ecstatic about certain successes to being all sullen because this just unbelievably massive offensive is
You know
perhaps
what I
not
wonder about?
achieving
I wonder
whatever.
about if the generation that needs, during their movie clips on YouTube Shorts and TikToks, that needs like
Mm.
Subway Surfers at the bottom of the screen so they don't look away during a movie scene that's already going to last like 20, 30 seconds in a YouTube clip. If that attention deficit disorder generation, as part of that
Mhm.
generation, I'm starting to think that's not the best type of person to depend your war effort upon. Someone that is easily distracted like a cat that sees a laser pointer.
I've already written off the like the Zoomer generation. Maybe it's all anecdotal, right? I couldn't tell you exactly what their sentiments are on Ukraine, what they're thinking about, but I can I can only tell you my anecdotes. I was speaking to a couple of friends and telling them, oh, like how I'm doing and everything, and I was telling them what I do week to week and following the war in Ukraine, and they were told me, oh yeah, that still's going on, huh? Which, yeah, it's still going on, guys,
Yes, it's still going on every day,
and it's
every
gonna be
hour.
going on.
It's gonna be going
Yeah,
on for a while.
I mean, even you can see it even with like people who covered it more the first weeks and months of the war. Now don't. Political YouTube certainly doesn't cover it
No,
as
they don't.
much.
I mean, I remember the
Uh,
first few weeks of the war, you had people watching live stream cameras of Kiev, just kind of waiting
yeah.
excitedly to see if the city would get captured or not. And then a few weeks later, they all just kind of dropped it like a hot cake, and just moved on to what was what was next and what was best for the SEO, best for the search algorithm.
Yeah, I remember, I keep repeating that, but I remember that I spoke to Xander Hall in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
probably like 3 or 4 days after the war had started, and I said that this war could last months, if not years. And he said, "Oh, you think this war could last years?" And I said, "Well, it's a possibility. I don't know for sure, but it looks really big." And it's really hard to keep the attention of the young generation, but I don't feel like those are going to be the critical demographic. The critical demographic are going to be the decision makers, the, let's say, the elite of Western countries.
You mean the
And
Midwest boomer?
mostly,
You mean the boomers and the suburbanite moms and dads?
yeah, and mostly like the military and political establishments in all these NATO countries, and to what extent they're willing to actually commit to this war long term. Because I've seen some like murmurs here and there. What was it? Not the Attorney General of NATO, but his secretary or something, saying that, oh, maybe we should consider Ukraine giving land for joining NATO or whatever. Like I half baked ideas like those. I feel like a lot of politicians are maybe just as flaky, if not more flaky, than the young generation. I feel like those politicians that don't have to fight wars, that don't have to take the political risk long term, just kind of slowly uh, I don't know, fade or lose interest or try to focus on something else, saying that Ukraine doesn't have a quick and easy resolution.
I
I feel
think
like a lot of
for
people were hoping for that
I think for
with the
a
counteroffensive.
lot of Westerners, especially Americans, war is kind of like more of an abstract concept. I don't know if I've ever said this to you. It's something that really rang true with me. But war is kind of something you kind of turn on or you turn off like a light switch. And whether you turn it on or off, how it affects your daily life, you don't really feel because we don't have like swarms of coffins coming back from Afghanistan. We don't. We fight the wars that we are fighting, the war on terror, for example, whatever we've authorized with the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, it's a bunch of low intensity conflicts around the world. I mean, it's something that's just doesn't affect, I think, the average American that much. And seeing that we don't have coffins coming back from this, like, I think for some people it's quite simple or easy to turn off your thoughts and not think about it. But since also no American feels any difference really when it comes to their daily life between that and any other war, even though the war in Ukraine has cost us so much less than the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, and has, I think, shown real benefits much more in getting a long-term ally that's very ideologically similar to us, that we can agree with and prosper with, that even though it has much more benefits in the long run and costs much less, there seems to be much more outrage about it because it's gotten caught in the partisan divide.
It's really a shame, right? Because um, Americans tend to not notice when much more money just goes around and comes
Oh,
around.
they have zero clue. Do you think there's anybody
Zero
like
idea.
look how little conversation there is right now about, for example, the coup in Niger, which overthrew a
Yeah.
government which we were funneling like I believe $500 million to, multiple people that we trained in U.S. facilities help overthrow the government, and there isn't a peep from a single person on the campaign trail about it, even though
Yep.
it's like that's something that's just straight up failed. It just failed, and not you couldn't even compare it in any way to what's going on in Ukraine. Yet it's gotten not a single peep from anyone.
This sounds callous, but I think that the Democrats should probably be on the attack with perhaps another culture war issue, trying to distract from the war in Ukraine, because for some reason, when the war in Ukraine is being focused on, the Americans are just getting divided over it for no good reason. I feel like
I
if
disagree
they
with you
aren't
so
paying attention,
much.
but hear me out, right? If they aren't paying attention to the war in Ukraine, I feel like the more technocratic and foreign policy-minded politicians in Washington are going to have a freer hand in providing more aid and more equipment with it being under the radar. Ideally, yes, I agree that most Americans would care for Ukraine and would support it to the best of their ability and would pressure their politicians to support Ukraine. But I feel like maybe I don't know. Maybe the average politician doesn't care, and without the pressure, they won't do it. But I feel like the division could. You see the calculus I'm working on here.
I
Kind
think
of,
this
yeah.
conversation is going to happen whether we like it or not. And so we should be involved in the conversation. I don't think if, like, for
That's fair
example,
enough.
the Democrats all decided they were going to stop talking about Ukraine and hope the Russians do the same, that's not going to shut Tucker or Vivek or Donald's big fat mouth. I don't think that's possible. While the Democrats have
No,
been
it
very
wouldn't.
good on, like, I guess the idea of enforcing party unity, I find it very difficult to believe that Kevin McCarthy is going to get Matt Gaetz to shut the fuck up. So I think it makes more sense to improve our messaging on Ukraine, because I know that there's an untapped reserve of support in Ukraine. I mean, an untapped reserve of support in the United States for Ukraine. There was a recent study done that showed that once you provided Americans with certain information, like the fact that Ukraine controls 83% of its territory, you talk about some of the equipment that's been destroyed, you just give them some information about the effect that our aid of that is the equivalent of like 0.3 to 0.4% of our GDP, right? As a percentage of
Yeah.
GDP, much less than Poland is given, or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Once you do that, you see 18 to 20 point jumps in support for Ukraine
Yeah, I
among
mean, the thing
Democrats,
is,
Republicans, and independents.
agreed, and I think that it's really weird how I mean, it talks to the Republicans' ability to make a problem out of everything. It's like Ukraine is something that would traditionally be something that both Republicans and Democrats would be supportive of, right? Fighting Russia. That's that's kind of like their whole the whole shtick of the war
I
horse,
don't
right?
really believe that, because we have failed on this war for so long when it comes to responding to Russian aggression. I mean, in the Obama administration, 2015, a year after Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea and was doing its actions in Donetsk and Luhansk, we had the Obama administration releasing statements saying that if Russia was to conquer all of Ukraine, it would produce a very problematic relationship. You know,
Oh wow,
not exactly
that's
not
incredible.
exactly the strongest, I think, rebuke. It was like the most they were sending over at the time was counter battery radar. The only time we actually sent anything that packed a punch was 2019, and that was held up by no other than Donald J. Trump as he tried to extort Zelensky for that aid. We have never, I think, really fulfilled our promise in the Budapest Memorandum until very recently. I don't think it was until 2022 that we ever really began to deliver on that promise. Until then, it was all just a bunch of empty words.
Yeah, no, it's kind of rough when it comes to like the American public and what they support and how there is a lot of culture war poisoning, and yeah, I feel like the it would be beneficial if the Democrats focused on maybe improving messaging on Ukraine or talking about the perhaps the successes that the Ukrainians have had, or I don't know what else, the amount of damage they have caused to Russian equipment. Um, I mean, I think that that could do a lot, and yeah, I see it. I see it your way. I also think that still that there is a quality to something not being a culture war issue, to
Well,
being
no,
something
it
that,
would be
yeah,
better if it wasn't a culture war issue. But the
yeah,
problem
is you can't
is
culture
that,
war
like,
issues.
it's kind, if it's, I don't even think we need to treat it as a culture war issue. We just need to treat it as a policy issue, no matter what. If there's anybody that is like challenging aid to Ukraine, whether it be because Ukraine's too woke, Russia's super based, or any number of reasons, they like, oh, America should just keep to itself, that I think it needs to be challenged, whether it's through the lens of the culture war or through the lens of a serious policy proposal or a
You
non-serious
know,
policy proposal because your name's Vivek.
I think you know which one should definitely be tackled most and bothers me the most. It's the most intuitive but wrongest of points when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to Ukraine. It's the, oh, America is failing over here. We're having this problem, that problem, but all the money is going to Ukraine.
That's true.
I'm having potholes in my road, but Zelensky's getting money.
We
The
really
worst.
need to take those cluster munitions and give them to the people of Hawaii to help them in their time of
People
need.
need to make those jokes. Holy shit. People like I want Democratic senators going out and saying, "What do you want us to do? Give Bradleys to homeless people? Is that what you want us to do? Dummies?" And also
This
saying
is what
that,
should
hey,
this is what we should do though. This is what we should really do. Every single time that comment is made, a piece of legislation should be entered into the House to provide housing to the homeless, to do any of these things.
Yes,
And we
yes.
should literally allocate the exact amount of money that we've sent over to Ukraine. We say like 45 billion. We'll just include the military
Yes.
funding. We'll provide
and
45 billion to deal with.
reject it every time.
Exactly. That's what I think we should do to shut down the conversation. I think you make it very.
That would be good,
and if we
yes.
pass it, we pass it, and then we have a house, and then we have housing reform in the United States. No matter what, it's a W. No matter what, it's W.
Mhm.
I want to talk to you
Every time.
about something back to the counteroffensive.
Oh, yeah, of course.
During the first few weeks, we got a lot of videos of burnt out Western equipment. Now, a lot of these videos were the same like lineup of vehicles, just from like 17 different angles, right? Because you need to you need to juice it for every tiny bit of like propaganda value as possible. Can you talk to me about the propaganda angle of this counteroffensive and how the Russians and Ukrainians have maneuvered around the narratives around the fighting in the South? And once we've finished that up, I want to talk to you about losses. I want to talk about vehicle losses, casualty, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I feel like some of the propaganda that I saw, not mostly from the Ukrainian side, but mostly about from Westerners supporting Ukraine, has kind of come back to bite us in the ass. Part of it has been, well, first of all, portraying Western vehicles as some sort of just wonder weapon. Oh, the Leopards are gonna be out hunting T-72s or whatever. Like all these like weird bullshit that was going on, all the weird AI graphics I saw. It just I found it ridiculous. Well, a lot of people were saying, "Oh yes, now that the perfect Western equipment is gonna hit the fields, it's gonna destroy the Russians immediately." And I kept saying, "Hey, you know, it's gonna be equipment. It's gonna get destroyed. Let's not like fight or get mad or cry every time like a piece of equipment is destroyed. They're gonna be destroyed. Just keep it in mind, you know."
The thing that gets me, the thing that gets me is that we never really were under the delusion that these battle tanks are going to be used in a tank versus tank capacity. I mean, that's not really that's not how this war has ever been fought. Is like T-72s fighting T-72s, Leopards fighting T-90 or whatever. It's never been that. It's mostly indirect fire and armored assaults to support infantry as they move forward. That's how we've really seen tanks get used. And so when some people are like comparing like tank v tank 1-to-1, what performs better in a tank on tank battle, that's not how these wars are being fought. What you should be talking about is how I mean, like there's been a few examples, but it's mostly been indirect fire and supporting infantry as they move forward. So I think really the stuff that should have been talked about, and I think this also actually shows the benefit of some Western equipment, is how much protection it offers to the people in the vehicles, which so far, even though we don't have hard data on it, it does seem like Western gear has been more protective for the people who are manning them, who are manning these, for example, the Bradleys, for example.
That's something that that the Ukrainian propaganda certainly has had like focused on, and thanking, you know, Western partners for providing such safe vehicles that keep their crews alive and fighting another day. So yeah, that's part of the equipment propaganda that bothered me, was the saying that, you know, it's gonna be another Wunderwaffe and just win the war immediately, just destroy the Russian lines, whatever. And the other part was the other, like, oh yeah, this counteroffensive is just gonna destroy the whole line, whatever. There were some genuine predictions that said, oh yeah, maybe, you know, the Russian units ahead of them are depleted, maybe the Ukrainians could achieve a massive breakthrough pretty quickly. But the Ukrainians themselves had kind of tempered expectations, and they kept saying, "Hey guys, let's not overplay what this offensive is going to be." But the very loudest of cheerleaders on Twitter and online and on all these analyst circles kept saying that, "Oh yeah, this is going to be the best. Like this is going to be this offensive is just going to destroy the Russians immediately," and that caused the Russians to respond with propaganda now, saying, "Oh, where's your big offensive? Hasn't even reached the first line." And those people, the way they have responded is either by claiming that, yes, actually, it has made huge progress and it has gone through all the defensive lines and Melitopol is about to fall. And on the other end, there's those that just have started dooming and saying, "Oh yeah, it's been a massive failure and it's the Ukrainians' fault and it's the Western's fault." I feel like all of this has been a bit annoying. It has been kind of mismanaged, and I feel like it has been mostly a propaganda boon for the Russians, saying that their of defense has held up. But again, this I don't think this matters that much. Like overall, it only matters as to what effect this has on Western leaders, in my opinion. Because I don't feel like much of anybody's opinion is going to change that thoroughly on supporting Ukraine. What matters on the ground, what happens on the ground, and what happens in the in the halls of Congress just kind of matters more than the minor propaganda wins and losses of each side. That's what I would say.
Do you think that there is any way to prepare a population for this type of a long, because this is just the case historically, that if a war lasts this long, it doesn't mean it can't end at this point, but it means it's probably gonna, if it lasts longer than 6 months, the war is probably gonna last a bit. It's probably not going to end at 8 months or 9 months. It's probably going to last a few years. What is the best thing you think countries can do in order to prepare their populations for Ukraine to, have to fight that long war? Because the Russian strategy, as we said earlier, is basically just to wait out the West until they get bored. And I don't know if you ever watched Toy Story, but I don't know if you remember that scene where Andy's like, I'm not having fun playing with you anymore, and he throws the toy to the ground. It's devastating. How does the world prevent itself from doing that to Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think this question has a couple of components. Perhaps how are Ukrainians themselves and the Ukrainian population preparing for a long war? Because this is also a matter that is very under discussed. And how the Westerners are preparing and how the Russians are preparing. I feel like the Westerners aren't really preparing. They're just kind of trying to not over leverage their capability in supporting Ukraine, keeping it kind of a foreign policy issue and not a countrywide issue, not saying basically that, not saying that this is our war, that we are in this war for the long haul, because I feel like a lot of Westerners would consider this kind of language hazardous for their political campaigns. So I feel like,
and that's something I've heard back from them. They see the issue as toxic.
Yeah. So instead, what they do is they try to leverage what capabilities exist already without impacting society that much. But I feel like this has to change.
They're trying to keep the war in that switch mode I was talking about. You're just flipping a switch. You're not impacting people.
Yeah, so eventually I want them to bite the bullet and decide that, yeah, we're in this for the long haul.
There seems to be some countries that are willing to do that, though, like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but the majority aren't.
The majority aren't, and trust me, like a lot of other European countries are going to be even less inclined. And the thing is, especially the ones with big stockpiles like Greece and Turkey, they're not gonna do that. They're not gonna support Ukraine to a large extent. It is disappointing to say, especially because they're so heavily equipped. But I don't feel like either country is going to make big steps. You know, Zelensky was recently in Athens, I think yesterday. Um, but still, I feel like big talk, but no real equipment deliveries of a significant number. It will come down to the U.S. and how the U.S. prepares its population, in my opinion. Um, and there, I feel like it being like a bit of a toxic culture war issue is a bit of a hindrance, but at the same time, I feel like it's a culture war issue that the
Well,
Democrats can win.
that's the thing
You
is
know?
there's a backside to it of being a culture war issue. Is if it's a culture war issue and one side really takes up the flag of that culture war issue, then if that side wins, then we've got at least until most likely the midterms, 2 years of probably solid support.
Yeah. So then it would make more sense if the Democrats really like took it up and fought for it and made the best possible arguments. Because to be fair, it's not that difficult a point to make. The evidence is on their side. They shouldn't like flake on it. And especially before when I was saying that they should try to like deprioritize it as a culture war issue, I was thinking more in the sense of inventing another culture war issue, which just isn't the kind of thing that the Democrats do that
We need
much.
another Barbie
Uh,
movie. We need the second Barbie
yeah,
movie to release
see,
like right now.
getting the Republicans distracted. You know, how long was Mr. Potato Head a problem? You know, that's the go-to example. But you know, CRT,
That's
right?
true.
That was huge. That was a huge culture war
Who
issue for the
can we get to
Republicans, but they moved
transition?
on.
Who can we get to transition?
What kind of issue could we get them to?
Let's ask Miley Cyrus to transition.
Oh yes, yes. Oh, you're right. Yeah, something like that. But you see what I mean? I feel like if you know, like taking it on as a culture war issue is something that the Democrats should do if the Republicans are sticking to it, and if the Democrats want to prepare the American population for maybe perhaps even further mobilization of American resources, more equipment being sent, perhaps more volunteers being sent. If they want to do that, they're going to have to fight that culture war issue or hope that something else comes up that distracts the Republican apparatus.
And it's true. At
So
least
that
for
they're
now,
not
we
focused
can.
on it.
At least for now, it's while the base of the Republican Party seems to be mostly set against more aid. There seems to still be a decent collection of elected Republicans who are still in favor of aid. So it isn't completely just Democrats believe this, Republicans believe that. At least not yet. And we're probably going to see that tomorrow with Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Chris Christie on the debate stage, probably clashing with people like Vivek Ramaswamy and others. I wanted to move on back to, well, actually, first I wanted to ask, how are the Russians preparing their domestic situation for a long war?
They are doing mostly like heavy propagandizing, um, and they're controlling the information flow to a certain extent. They're trying to show themselves as competent commanders doing fighting this war to against Ukraine. They're trying also to portray it as a sort of defensive war and a war to like protect Russia, a war to like eliminate this danger, and a war that their brave soldiers are fighting. So they're going on the propaganda angle, but they will have to demand increasing sacrifices from their population, and I think they know that. So they're gonna have like a kind of a carrot and stick approach that a lot of authoritarian regimes do when they're at war. They're going to sort of provide incentives for supporting the war, incentives for giving volunteers or providing money or aiding the army, or maybe they'll blow up in social media every time, let's say, oh, locals from let's say Murmansk decided to provide a couple of pickup trucks to the army. Oh wow, look at that. And then they will brutally penalize any dissent and any voices that speak out against the war. Like for example, they did with Girkin. What's his Igor Strelkov, right? That guy, Igor Girkin. I
Brave
said both
Russian
names anyway.
patriot. Yep.
Yeah, Yeah, that I mean, not that I have any sympathy for that piece of shit, but he was a dissenting voice against Putin and kept dooming on Telegram, which is perpetually funny. But they decided that he was saying like too much shit, and they tried to shut him down, and I think they will continue to do that with channels so that they can keep better control over the information flow, because for Russia, it's better for the average citizen to not quite understand what the cost of this war is, because then mobilizing 200 and 300,000 soldiers more won't make that huge a difference. Russia is a big country and they have a big population and they can mobilize more. They definitely can mobilize more. So if Putin feels like a further mobilization and further investment into this war won't affect him politically, he will do that, and he's taking steps to prepare, I guess, for that longer war. Don't know to what extent he'll be fully successful, but I find it difficult to see him getting.
He does seem scared to fully commit, though.
Oh yeah, because he saw what happened, with Prigozhin, or like he saw how people just kind of didn't react to Prigozhin's coup, and the army didn't do anything. Uh, I mean, he kind of had to like rely on Zolotov and the Kremlin guard and whoever else to block the road, and some people with excavators apparently, and not even in the Air Force crapped the bed. Everybody just kind of had a little panic mode there. So Putin, of course, is thinking that, hey, if I overcommit, what does that mean? So, but I feel like if he felt that he had total control over the information space, total control over or predictability as to what the Russian population would do, and what the elites of Russia would do if the war escalates further, he would try to win it still. I think he still believes he can. But of course he's gun shy. It makes sense that he's gun shy when it comes to further mobilization, because keep in mind, well, further mobilization of personnel is something that Russia could do relatively easily. Mobilizing the economy is much more difficult, because it
also
means
it's easy
long-term,
to draft somebody. It's not easy necessarily to train them.
Yeah, well, for one, yes, but also anything you put towards your military industrial capacity in wartime won't be something that leads to growth after the war is over. So Russia is a developing economy. It's looking to grow still. And if they start sinking 20, 30, 40% of their GDP into the war, just building factories,
They're
building
already
everything.
sinking like at least a third of their federal budget into the war.
Yeah, but if they started like sinking way more, I'm saying like fully commit, like Ukraine is, for example, committing. They don't have backers that will necessarily bankroll their recovery after, and the Chinese aren't the best to rely on. The Russians know that. So that's why they're gonna face economic hardship if they overcommit.
Can we transition over one more question on this? So it's the Americans, it's the Russians. What about the Ukrainians? How are the Ukrainians positioned for the long war?
So with the Ukrainians, I feel like the main thing that Ukraine has to mitigate is concerns over the leadership not being competent enough to win the war. I feel like this isn't the strongest voice right now, but if this war is going to continue in an attritional manner without the front lines moving that much, the Ukrainian population will, to a certain extent, get tired. It's kind of what France faced with in World War One. The population was tired. Sometimes there were mutinies. Sometimes they felt that they were overdrafted, even though they were fighting an existential war in World War One. There were still domestic problems when the war kept dragging on and with thousands dying. So Ukraine, even though it the population certainly more motivated to keep going, they will still have to concern themselves to not like flagrantly wasting lives, like maybe in not getting killed en masse in some weird attack. Um, I feel like the Ukrainians will have to focus there, and they will probably focus the fact that they're in an existential war, of course, and also they are doing a good job of prioritizing just how brutal the Russians are and what they are doing to the civilians of Ukraine, basically motivating and angering the Ukrainian population, telling them that, hey, you're fighting for your children, you're fighting for your land, and we're gonna win. But I think that the Ukrainian public has already bought those messages. The part that they will have to content with is now having tasted success. It will be harder to convince them that it isn't just some kind of political or military failure, that they aren't going forward. You know, if they have to fight this war fully in attrition mode with static front lines, there are gonna be questions. Hey, why did you succeed in Kherson? Why did you succeed in Kharkiv, and you can't succeed now? Is the command incompetent? Can they not get our brave boys to win? Do our brave boys waste their lives for nothing? You know, those kinds of questions, and those are unavoidable. It's a war.
Do you
You know?
think the conversation, and this is something I'm interested in, do you think if the conversation drifted over to something like that the conclusion would be, and I have my own assumptions definitely being here, that the conclusion would be, okay, we need to end the war, or the conclusion would be, okay, we need to get rid of this leadership and continue to struggle?
Oh, definitely the latter. They're not gonna just end the war. It's not in their hand, in my opinion.
Hmm.
Like the Ukrainian population won't. I don't think they will accept while their army is in fighting shape. I don't think they would ever accept a big settlement. They would see it as a stab in the back. What I would see is that if they don't see any tangible results, that they might opt for more radical leadership or agitate for something like this. Perhaps the military taking more control, or veterans taking more control. This kind of stuff just kind of happens sometimes. And Zelensky has decided on suspending elections, I think, until the war is over, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this could even
Well,
be
until
used
martial
against.
law is over, I believe.
Yeah. Well, that's potato potato. It basically means until the war is over.
It could essentially
Martial
mean
law
that,
won't.
yeah.
Yeah, but so this is something that could bite Zelensky in the ass. It could be something that say, hey, you know, like he's keeping control over the country, isn't allowing elections. You know, we'll have to be more radical about supporting Ukraine. It could empower the nationalists. Who knows? But personally, I feel like Ukraine is in a decent enough position, but they will still have to be careful about the kind of attrition they're taking and the kind of fighting that they're going to be engaging in, because of course, you know, having tasted success, believing in their own victory, will lead the Ukrainian population to want more territorial gains, more places liberated, because you know, back in the beginning of the war, it was seen as, oh, look how well we're doing, even though we're kind of doomed. But
I do.
now
Continue.
it's different, you know.
I do want to ask you though, because we were talking about this earlier when we were analyzing how this counteroffensive did. We weren't just saying this village was taken or that village was taken, because when you look at the amount of villages taken, it wasn't a tremendous amount. If you compare it to the Kharkiv counteroffensive, which was like 500 settlements in 3.5 weeks, it's not really that comparable. But there's a lot of ways that it isn't being measured. I have a concern that the only way people are measuring military success is by the colors on the map changing. That's the only way that people are measuring military success. When I feel like you can have military success in a bunch of other ways by destroying people's capacity to fight, doing things like taking out logistical lines that'll help you down the road. Are you at all afraid that people are not judging this counteroffensive holistically?
Oh, they definitely aren't. They can't. It's really hard. the reason why people over focus on lines on the map is because they can see them. It's something more tangible. Destroyed equipment is kind of something that both sides announce on a weekly basis, but nobody pays attention because people don't really care and don't really understand what it means to lose 10 planes or one plane, what it means to lose 1,000 tanks. People just don't know these numbers, don't understand them. They don't know what sounds good or what is good. A lot of them will also believe that it's bullshit, and understandably so sometimes. But I think that they're over focusing on front lines moving because that's what is more perceptible. That's why it becomes viral when there's a big explosion. Let's say a bridge gets blown up or an ammo depot or whatever. When there's like big fire, big explosions, that's also visible. That also gets publicized. When there was that stunt that the Ukrainians pulled where they got into Belgorod, right?
Yeah.
They went to that oblast. That also got big news. Um, it's like it's the frontline moving and gimmicks that get people excited. Focusing on attrition is really difficult for the average person. It just kind of fades into the background because it happens every week. Attrition happens all the time, every day, every minute. But big stunts, frontline moves, those don't happen as much. And I feel like it doesn't matter how you perceive this offensive, how we perceive it, like me and you. Because I could make arguments for it being a success in certain ways, a failure in others. Most people are going to see it as a failure, I think. Most people,
if it
the
ends
public,
as it is right now.
yeah. And that's because there was a certain expectation built into this offensive, not as much from the Ukrainians, mostly from their backers in the West, that this would be just like a blowout, right? That it would be a big victory, that they would reach the sea. And if they don't do that, if it goes as it seems to be going, if that what is most likely is that it won't like reach the sea, people are going to be disappointed, and managing this perceived failure is going to be more important than how big of a failure it was in itself, if you know what I mean, or if it was a partial success. Personally, I feel like we could make the call that this was a partial success or a success based on what happens in the next couple of months, but this is not going to be enough. It's not going to convince people that that are mostly focusing on front lines moving. They're going to be like, oh, the line was there. And it will be even easier for like propagandists on the Russian side to say, oh yeah, big success, dude, you moved like 5 kilometers. What success? You didn't even take Tokmak. What success? And okay, whatever, we don't have to listen to these people, but there is a concern. There is the concern that saying like that this front lines don't move, it's going to be a conceptual, like people are going to be perceiving this offensive as a failure, and I don't think there's that much we could do about that. We could only just argue that, hey, listen, you're missing a few arguments. Sure, it didn't reach what we wanted, but it did a few things, and it doesn't exclude the possibility of victories in the future. It will sound disappointing. People are gonna be disappointed. I don't believe that that it's gonna be like. I think that's unavoidable, but I think that it can be mitigated long term, and people are gonna be paying less attention to it. There have been other like failed attacks that Ukraine has done. This isn't going to be like the failed. When I say failed, in the sort of what was promised, what happened type of deal. I don't feel like this is going to be like hugely different. Sure, it's more publicized, but I believe that Ukraine can recover from this optical failure in the West. I don't think it's going to be like decisive or
speaking of losses of man, material, and equipment. I wanted to ask you, because obviously not all the data is publicized. As much as we can look at the ORCS lists and what is available on open source A lot of this data is not out there. But of what is out there, can you tell us anything about the amount of casualties that are being taken? Because I saw a lot of videos of like vehicles burning on both sides from this, and I'll see people republish the same videos again and again and again. Sometimes people will pretend they're new, sometimes they won't, and it'll just be a new angle. What is the data on losses?
It's kind of hard to tell, and Oryx is kind of tapping out nowadays.
He has
he's
tapped out.
tired.
He's didn't think it was gonna become what it became, the giant open source
Yeah.
project trying to list Russian casualties. And not to mention when the Russians have lost like 2,300 tanks, it's not an easy, and that's just what's publicly known. I mean, that's not an easy task to list.
Yeah, it isn't. And um, wait, go back. What was the?
My question
And
is, my question
yeah.
was, there was a lot of like speculation on casualties and specifically things like equipment losses. A lot of people publishing the same footage over and over and over again. What is the actual picture here?
Well, I think that even though it's kind of hard to come across numbers, what we can definitively say is that it's a massive meat grinder. Lots of people are dying, and I think that like the Russians are suffering a lot, but it's hard to tell if the Ukrainians aren't suffering as much. They're probably suffering less in certain areas, though. I feel like the Ukrainians have probably suffered more when it comes to equipment and manpower losses, but the Russians have suffered more in terms of logistical damage. They have suffered more aviation losses in this war. Sorry, in the south, they like losing helicopters and stuff. They have suffered definitely more with their artillery getting damaged and destroyed than they had in previous months, and they're certainly feeling the heat. It's not like it's nothing, but I feel like the Ukrainians also, because they're attacking against fortified positions with to a degree an artillery disadvantage and not that huge a manpower advantage, yeah, they are suffering a lot of casualties. The Ukrainians are definitely suffering a lot of manpower loss, and but I feel like the Ukrainians are still in a position to replace it to an extent, but the losses have caused the Ukrainians to be more conservative. I don't think it's mainly the manpower losses that have caused that. I think it's the equipment losses. Losing engineering vehicles to the extent that the Ukrainians have lost them in this offensive has hampered it. And those are harder to replace, harder to find. And with those those earlier, Leopard losses and Bradley losses, a striker recently was lost, and that got publicized a bit. All those things lead the Ukrainians to be more conservative with their attacks in terms of using equipment. Also because partly because of like losing it hurts, and partly because they don't believe it would work. Attacking in big armored formations. So I feel like you could make an argument that the Russians are suffering more. I see it as more of a toss-up, and casualties being spread into different sectors for different.
They're being hurt in different ways.
Yeah, they're being hurt in different ways. But I feel like the Russians are much more fragile when it comes to manpower losses right now, because they haven't mobilized in a long, long time. So if the Ukrainians could continue with their logistics strikes and could continue at treating the defenses of the Russians, even if the Russians keep producing tanks or whatever, they won't solve the problem of manpower without further mobilizations. And I feel like if Putin is going to do a mobilization, he's going to do it over the winter, same as last time. While his frontline troops are resting, funnel in new soldiers slowly, get them to learn the ropes, some on the front, some behind, and yeah, I feel like they're being hurt in different ways, but it's a meat grinder overall. Really, really tough going for everybody.
I have two more questions. The first question is, and there's been some speculation about this, Could the Ukrainians just keep attacking in the winter if they wanted to? Or is that unbelievably risky?
I think they could, especially in the manner that they are now. Larger armored assaults would be difficult. There will probably be more casualties, but it's not impossible. It's just that it would be harder to exploit big breakthroughs. It would be tougher on the soldiers, and especially that Ukrainian soldiers have been complaining that they haven't gotten more than 2 weeks of leave this entire war. Um, it's not an easy task. I feel like Ukraine will also have to consider, okay, how much equipment can we actually waste if we can't see that this offensive is going to bear fruit, right? Because if it hasn't led to a breakthrough by the winter, I doubt there's going to lead to a breakthrough right after, unless the Ukrainians have a really good idea that it will, which is hard to know what they know. Um, it is a possibility they might, but I think it's unlikely. I think it's gonna be more trouble than it's worth. I feel like the Ukrainians, if the winter sets in, there's more mud, they would slow down, gather their wits, and basically petition the West for more equipment and more training and the F-16s and all of this other stuff that they're expecting.
Got you. Now I want to transition into one final topic before we wrap up. And this is connected to what we were talking about earlier, and we did mention this earlier. There's a recent U.S. intel report that was published with the Washington Post that we did comment on recently, and it seemed to show that American officials were somewhat frustrated with Ukrainian officials, and the American officials really wanted the Ukrainian officials to engage in combined arms warfare, big armored assaults, and that they expected the Ukrainians to take casualties during these attacks, but that they had, they had rationalized for that, they had calculated for that, and that it was the cost of breaking the Russian line. And that the Americans are kind of frustrated that the Ukrainians, after trying that for the first week or two, and we could see that from the videos that were published shortly after of these failed armored assaults, that they changed strategy and they went back to what they're used to doing. And what they have experience doing, and to make maybe a slower progress. What do you make of this debate and these points by American intelligence officials? I think I got a hint of what you believe earlier, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to address this directly in the article directly, because the article talked about a lot of things.
Yeah. No, yeah, I feel like they're a little bit, if it is to be believed, right? Because it comes from anonymous sources, whatever. If it is, if we take it at face value, I feel like they're a bit lost in the sauce. I mean, come on, really? You're expecting an army that doesn't have your capabilities to do what you would do? They won't. And even if you train them to do it, they won't. They will do what they can do. And that should reflect as much on the aid and type of support that they have been provided. But even beyond that, they talked about maybe concentrating their forces on one point. How would they do that without air supremacy? They can't do that. They can't do that without maintaining pressure on the entire line. If you're gonna break the front, you're gonna have to have a superiority in one place and maybe parity in the rest. But they have parity almost everywhere. So I feel like there are some unrealistic expectations placed on the Ukrainians. I feel like a lot of this frustration is somewhat politically motivated, right? It's all this that we were talking about earlier, about hoping that this is going to be an easy solve. Reaching the sea with this offensive is just going to end the war, and everybody's going to be happy, and it's going to be easier to support Ukraine through that. And now that it's a more frustrating offensive, all of a sudden there's a pissing contest and a hissy fit from the intelligence community and the friggin' the support that the American military establishment. I find it somewhat pathetic. I feel like, okay, you're frustrated. I get it. But they can't do what you're asking them to. They can only do what they have the capabilities and equipment to do. And as far as I'm aware, they're doing a pretty good job with what they have, and they're playing it right for the most part. Despite my grievances, I feel like they're minor. for the most part, they're fighting this right. I feel like, can you imagine if they had like committed fully to armored assaults and just wasted all of the equipment given to them by the West? Well, what would that have played out as? I feel like that's what these intelligence officials should be asked is, okay, would you rather take the gamble of attacking with insufficient equipment until the Ukrainians are completely spent? How would that have played out in the public eye? You know, so I feel like even though it's less exciting, the type of offensive they're doing, it's much safer. It's safer for sure. It's not as much of a gamble, and they're also gambling with the cards they're dealt. Right? They don't have the two aces up their sleeves that the Americans have every time. They don't have the massive U.S. Air Force like blowing everything to bits in front of them. So with the hand they're dealt, they're doing a decent job, and I feel like these officials should kind of lay off and also I don't know, touch grass when it comes to asking the Ukrainians to concentrate offensive capability in one area. You can't really do that very easily in Ukraine. It's just not the battlefield. Some people maybe have outdated opinions. Who knows?
Gotcha. I know I said this would be your last question, but I have one more question. F-16s
Hit me.
from Denmark and the Dutch, the Netherlands, we're seeing probably around 40, vaguely. It's not, I don't think we have exact numbers right now, but we're going to see probably vaguely around 40 being sent. These are not the most modern aircraft. These are going to be some old F-16s with that are working on equipment that are going to have to be refitted. Oh, it's 42. Somebody just told me 42. That are going to have to 42. Be refitted. They're going to need work done on them in order for them to be ready. They're going to have to build the logistics in the country, get, train the personnel that are going to be maintaining the aircraft. The earliest estimates I've heard for when we're going to see F-16s in Ukraine, if everything is done very quickly and there's not a lot of delays and bureaucracy, is spring next year. If we're very fast. What type of impact can F-16s have, and on what scale would they need to be implemented for them to have a real impact on the war? Like how much aircraft, how much would they need?
I'd expect them kind of late next year, not really spring. It would take some time, and also deploying these aircraft before perhaps the crews are fully ready isn't the best idea. Yeah, I feel like they could have an impact. They would make the Russian Air Force definitely more scared to engage in support missions. It's not like those planes would then go over to bombing. I feel like the main impact they could have is countering to a certain extent the Russian Air Force, but they would need more airframes, maybe 100, maybe 150, but I couldn't tell you the number exactly. I'm not super well versed as to the capabilities of these F-16s, especially in this kind of air defense
air-to-air
environment.
and ground and air-to-ground.
Of course, yes. But that's like generally speaking, yes, that's what they can do. But I don't expect them to ever do like ground attacks. The Russian air defense network is really vast and very powerful, and they can be intercepted just like any other plane. However, when it comes to air-to-air capability, they could have an edge against the Russians, and they could keep Russian fighters at bay, and by extension Russian bombers maybe a bit more scared, but Russian bombers are further away. They tend to launch from Russia proper. It's going to be unlikely that they're able to be harassed by F-16s. However, they would definitely have a better shot of reducing whatever limited close air support the Russian Air Force is providing to its soldiers.
Like, so for example, with its helicopters, one of the reports I keep hearing about is that they'll keep their helicopters like 8 kilometers away, just outside of the range of like shoulder-mounted like Stinger missiles and stuff that the Ukrainians can use to shoot them down. And even though it's not terribly accurate due to the distance, they'll basically lob rockets and munitions at the Ukrainian positions to harass them as they try to advance.
Yeah, I mean, even worse, they are able to fire ATGMs. Those helicopters. I think that's the biggest problem. That helicopters, the biggest headache that they give to the Ukrainians is the fact that they can just launch ATGMs and just basically snipe unsuspecting infantry fighting vehicles and tanks from many kilometers away. But yeah, the F-16s would be a good start, and I think that a lot of things have to go right for them to come like in the middle of next year. It's also the question of Ukrainian airfields and air crews. There was also that controversy recently about Ukrainian pilots picked for the F-16 training programs just not really knowing English, which is just like an extra like super annoying hurdle to cross.
There is
Like, why?
rumors about former American pilots who have retired and are in, in the civilian sector coming to Ukraine and flying planes. There has been speculation about that, and it's not completely unheard of.
Yeah, I mean, why not? If they're gonna, I don't know if there were any of the volunteers, if any of them were tankers ever in Ukraine. Um, I think that a lot of them just fought as infantry and maybe in like mobile, in infantry fighting vehicles and AFVs, and whatever like Bradleys and stuff. But yeah, I guess that if they're volunteers and if they know how to fly F-16s, why not? It would be up to the Ukrainians, however, to decide that because it's a bit of a more sensitive thing to put a volunteer to fly planes in your own country. You have to wonder, hey, how rusty is this individual? You know, this pilot. Have they gone through the same training program that our boys have gone through now, with the most updated information? Would they be willing to? You know, those kinds of questions. But I think that it's not like completely unheard of. It's not. It doesn't sound too outlandish, at least.
Okay, got you. Oh, I know. I keep saying last question, but last question.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
What is going to be necessary for the West when it comes to increasing production for them to sustain Ukraine through the next few years? Because I've seen America, the American government say, okay, we're increasing from 24,000 shells produced to 80,000. The French are saying that they're increasing the shell production. I know we've seen the South Koreans help with shell transfers. Artillery is the main killer in this war. It kills 60 to 70% of people. It's definitely the thing that has tried to kill me the most. So
Oh yeah, I saw.
what is the elements to this when it comes to artillery shell production?
I mean, if the Ukrainians are, spending close to say 300,000 shells a month, right? Let's say 250,000 shells a month, the Americans are gonna have to scale up their production quite a bit. And yeah, shells are super important. And also to a certain extent, Abrams, being able to send more Abrams. I don't know why they decided on 30. That sounds like arbitrarily
Hey,
low.
31.
31, right? You're correct. Why not? I don't know, like 100. Say I'm just like throwing out there just numbers, but I feel like they should have invested more in that sense. But yeah, artillery is the most important by far, and I feel like I couldn't tell you exactly what the ability of the Americans is to scale up their existing production, but they would have to perhaps bite the bullet and decide on expanding production with federal funding, like creating, maybe even converting some industrial capacity to artillery production, even funding foreign artillery production, purchasing more shells for Ukraine as they have been doing. I don't know. I feel like they need to keep it up, and I feel like they could reach the point where they are sustaining the Ukrainians fully, but it's a bit difficult. It will take them some time, and that's why, you know, perhaps the cluster munitions, even though they were a controversial choice, they may not have been that much of a choice at all. The U.S. can't just give its entire stockpile, and they've already given quite a bit. So now it's up to them to increase production tangibly.
Thank you very much for coming on today's stream. Where can people go and find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at I think I'm at Richard Hannay 17, and you can find me on Twitch, which is Richie RICHIE underscore Hannay HANNAY. And I stream once in a while, mostly news about Ukraine and sometimes other geopolitical issues. Maybe I'll start gaming, who knows, but I can't just talk to people and game at the same time. I don't know how you do it or how anybody
I'm
else
very
for that
bad at it.
matter.
I don't do it very often. I'm very bad at it.
Yeah, and on Twitter I post all the time, and I post variety of stuff, not just the war. So yeah, go follow me there for sure.
Thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it, buddy.
Yeah, man. Good luck with everything over there in Ukraine, and good safe travels, man. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.